name's Angus Hay, and I've been involved with the internet in South Africa for quite a few years, but my current job is with Neotel. I'm employee number 2 at Neotel, and I've done quite a few things whilst I've been at Neotel. But I started out in the internet in South Africa in around about 1991, because that was the time when the internet was starting to happen in South Africa. I happened to be a postgraduate student at Wits University in electrical engineering, and that's really where the internet started to happen, I guess, in Joburg, was via Wits University, and particularly I was the sucker who ended up having to connect our network, which was basically the network in the electrical engineering building, which had just been built then, the new engineering building on West Campus at Wits, to the world, to the internet. And so I got involved with the guys in UCT, with the guys in what was then the University of Natal, and most importantly with the guys in Rhodes, where the connection to the world was happening. So yeah, I was the Wits guy involved in creating the original Uninet backbone, and that's really how we got connected to the world. But it was a much bigger thing than we realized. So the first thing was just the sheer scale of it. It didn't seem that big, and I guess in absolute terms it wasn't. So, you know, we really started out with just connectivity to the world via dial-up modems and so on, to do some email and a little bit of academic stuff that was happening. But there was no sense in which this was a big commercial enterprise. The internet was firstly very much an academic and research and scientific thing for us, and this was during the era of sanctions in South Africa, so actually we weren't able to connect to anything commercially. The only domain that existed was ac.za, because that was really what it was. It was an academic network, and we had permission to connect to the world as an academic network, but for the rest there was no possibility of anyone else in South Africa being connected commercially. We didn't feel like we were pioneering anything, but I suppose we were playing around and making it work. And the most exciting thing was exactly that. It was the fact that we did get connectivity and everything was working. But the internet in those days wasn't what you think of as the internet today. So I think people looking at it from today's perspective would probably be surprised by the fact that the most important thing that just did not exist was the World Wide Web. So when you talk about the internet today, you talk about the World Wide Web. People tend to confuse the two. They think of websites as being the internet. We had a number of Unix servers that we worked on in the lab. So amongst other things, I was technically not supposed to be spending all my time messing around on the internet. I was supposed to be doing postgraduate research for my doctorate. And for my doctorate, I had a few Unix servers that had been set up to run various things which were much more important than the internet. But they became the nodes. They became the identifiable servers that connected to the world. And I remember on one of them, we downloaded something called Mosaic, which was a web browser. I'm not even sure it was called a web browser then. It was something that read HTML anyway. And I looked at this, and my immediate reaction to looking at HTML and you know, documents presented on a web browser was, no one's ever going to use this. You know, who would format something like that? That was the internet. I suppose we thought of it a little bit like slightly upgraded bulletin boards, if anybody remembers what those are. And the other big thing was you know, used to chat. There was IRC chat, and there were other things that we did that were communicating using the internet. But for the most part, that was about it. It was ways to make network A talk to network B. There was no sense in which there was this large cloud of information out there. It certainly wasn't something where we could, you know, like go to a web page. Well, there were no web pages. But there was no sense in that there was this vast repository of information. You could go and find sites, but of course if you found somewhere that you could get information, it was FTP. You were downloading files from a site. So, and often you'd kind of have to know what it was you were looking for exactly, either an IP address or, if you were lucky, a domain name that got you to the right place. But yes, the thing that was the internet when we started is not what the internet is today. Quite apart from the obvious, the bandwidths and all the other things that have changed. To be fair, I think it's complicated by a couple of things. So it's complicated by the fact that, as I said previously, we're in an environment where at that stage it was really only an academic network, and there were fairly strong barriers to it not being academic. And I think the other thing that constrained it is that we were in a fairly restrictive environment in terms of communications. So, to take a slightly obscure example, but it does make the point, is if you're familiar with Wits University, that's when the old Mill Park had been converted to West Campus at Wits University, and they're separated by the M1 highway. And the access into the new West Campus was a bridge built across that highway, and that bridge crossed right into the new engineering building. So we were sitting in the new engineering building, and we had to get physical connectivity, and ideally, reasonably high bandwidth connectivity for those days, back into the rest of the campus, and obviously things were hubbed out of the computer center as well. Crossing that highway, it was a public road. So there was all kinds of challenges just getting across that public highway, because legally that would have required telecom to cross that highway. Nowadays you wouldn't think twice. You would, you just put a trench across and off you'd go. But I think, Mike Laurie is probably the better person to tell you about some of the huge challenges they had with other connectivity generally. But yes, it was, we did not have the best possible connectivity environment on which to do this. So yes, I think the user demand drove it, but there was a lot of pushing and shoving to get connectivity. The fact that we connected via roads to an obscure corner of the United States also says something about the nature of the environment we were in. I think if South Africa had been in a different situation, if we hadn't been under sanctions at the time and there hadn't been that environment, I think we would have had much more obvious, direct interaction and connectivity that didn't feel like we were going through back doors into the world. That said, I do have one other story which is probably worth telling, and Mark Elkins will probably not forgive me for this, but we were Wits, so we were wits.ac.za, and we were pretty legitimate, and we had IP addresses that were legitimately academic, but there was a fairly clear rule that said, don't let any non-academic IP addresses leak onto this network, because Randy Bush, who was at the other end of that link, was very carefully policing it to make quite sure that we were not reaching the understanding that this was a purely scientific and academic research network. And Mark Elkins worked for Olivetti in Braamfontein. So with great effort, and we managed to get a link between Wits and Olivetti in Braamfontein, and he was very keen to get this whole thing up and running. So we ran it up and we connected it onto our PC router. We thought we'd got it right, but we accidentally let some IP addresses leak out onto the world. And Randy pulled the plug out and disconnected South Africa. And it was like, oops, who did that? So we apologized and unplugged him, but that was an odd environment. But I think that was very much the spirit of how things were being done. Everybody was trying to get a connection in here and a cable in there and connect to things and make it happen. And I guess not very long after that is when things really exploded. So it's difficult to say that demand drove it in the first couple of years, because that really was the academic institutions, and there was a little bit of demand, but it's like most things. There were a couple of users who really were using a lot of it, but most people didn't know it existed. Many developed countries had a first wave where everybody got broadband, or much of the market got broadband because it came over the existing telephone lines. We didn't see that in South Africa because most people didn't have telephone lines. And I think now we're seeing that catch up. So, and I guess a lot of developing countries have the same issue. So there is a debate, is everything going to be mobile? Is everything going to be fixed? But I think there's no doubt that ultimately we need high bandwidth, deep reach, fixed connectivity, call it broadband, that gets everywhere. The philosophy we've always adopted as Neotel has been, let's get the fiber to as many places as possible, because the fiber is the future-proof technology that gets as much out there as possible. Once you have physical fiber, then there are a lot of things you can do on top of it. Look, I'd already indicated that the second wave of broadband is now an organic process. It's happening, and I think the thing that's driving that most is the rapid growth of fiber. So everybody is now delivering fiber. Perhaps too many people are delivering fiber, but there's no doubt that we have to move from a traditional broadband network, and a large percentage of South African broadband is still on copper, and it's not going to cope with the bandwidth and performance that's needed. We have to move to fiber. So it's just a question of who's going to build and how fast and how ubiquitously, and are we going to get open access on the access networks? Are we going to get partnerships? Are we going to get growth that actually generates the fiber? And I think the regulatory environment there plays a big part. You know, we need to be able to deploy rapidly. Everybody has to get in there. But I think, as has been the case with most of communications in South Africa, is that competition is the defining factor. It's not good enough to say, well, you know, we're wasting money by duplicating networks. It's a nice idea, but the reality is that companies are going to spend money. And companies will spend money if there's an incentive to get customers, to grow the market. We know there's a huge demand for broadband. We're going to have to grow that broadband. It's just a question of, can we do it as rapidly as possible? And can we do it in an environment where there aren't artificial limitations in regulation or anything else that prevent us from doing that? So there's no doubt that growing fiber networks to businesses, to homes, that's got to be the big trend. I do think on the back of that, we are going to see the other trend I just mentioned now, which is the whole idea that increasingly the balance of power between who's providing the content and the services versus who's providing the piece of wire, that's going to become a very interesting dynamic. So yes, and back to your earlier point about where do you want to be in the stack? Well, it kind of depends. I think you can't park yourself somewhere in that stack. You have to see where the demand and the competitive environment is and what people want. You know, so if what people want is content, maybe you want to facilitate that content.